the best 2-mana cards ever. As you can see behind me, that's a video idea I tried out 6+ years ago, way back in 2015. And all that time, that video only got 3,800 views. What? And we're revisiting it, and we're doing a whole series here on best cards per mana cost. And this time around, we're going to talk about 2-mana cards. Last time around, 6 years ago, these were the 10 best 2-mana cards that old-timey Regis chose. Some pretty powerful cards on this list, and frankly, a couple of these are going to show up again, and a handful of these I think are still pretty good arguments to make the list, because as many good 1-drops as I thought could fit in this video, there's even more 2-drops. There's so many possible 2-drops to include that everybody's going to have their own preferences. I picked 10 based on a mix of sort of their peak relevancy, if they were like really, really good in any given meta that caught my attention. So cards that got nerfed like multiple times, or just really built around some like defining deck. Or alternatively, I wanted to focus on cards that had a really long lifespan, cards that were impactful for multiple years. So some of those like staple classic cards, for instance. And based on those two criteria, I picked these 10 cards. So up first, let's talk about one of those staple cards. You saw Fiery War Axe here, made it onto the old list, and although this card hasn't been relevant for a long time, I definitely wanted to pay reverence to it, because for many, many years in Hearthstone, Fiery War Axe single-handedly carried warrior decks through its ability to deal with your opponent's early game boards. Having this weapon that could clean up your opponent's 2-drop or 3-drop allowed you to get things rolling, created an opportunity often on turn 3 to kind of swing some tempo back in your favor. It gave control decks a way to, deal with stuff without overcommitting, essentially. And that's why this guy was called the Fiery Win Axe, because if you had Fiery War Axe early on in warrior games, you often felt like you were probably going to win those matchups. Sometimes just turn phase 2, 6 damage total for 2 mana isn't anything to scoff at. So, you may have forgotten how good Fiery War Axe was for a really, really long time there at the start of Hearthstone, but I didn't, and I think you pretty much have to recognize the importance of this card for year after year early on. All right, so for this one, we're going to go in the exact opposite direction. It's Mind Render Elusia, and I kind of forgot this card started at 2 mana. It got a nerf to 3 mana, and then it got nerfed again, of course, to totally change the effect, which has since killed Mind Render Elusia. And this card's interesting. I think there's sort of two stories for this one. For certain parts of the player base, this card was absolutely insanely brokenly strong, so typically higher level players, whereas if you're a lower level player, you might not have encountered this one too much or thought it was really all that important. But it existed as both a combo disruption card where you could just steal your opponent's combo pieces, like take their Il'gynoth, for instance. High level legend players won a lot of games doing that sort of thing. But then also when we saw like face Shadow Priest come along in Stormwind early on, before this got its second nerf, Elusia at 3 mana even served as this great almost finishing tool where you just dump your hand and then give your opponent an empty hand where they basically had no way to interact with your board. Kind of this like super Lotheb style effect. And across those two different approaches for Elusia, I wanted to recognize this one because it very much peaked at some absurd power levels. And any card that gets nerfed twice, I think you have to recognize as just having some kind of insanely high power spike. So maybe a short-lived lifespan here for Elusia, but a very, very powerful one. So next up, let's talk about our buddy Prince Keleseth. Of course, the 2-drop to end all 2-drops. He's such a good 2-drop that he's the only one you run when you play him. And of course, in Keleseth's era in standard format, he was really powerful. A lot of decks were able to play Keleseth on 2 and just absolutely run away with games. There was that kind of Keleseth tempo package with all these neutral minions that just curved out really beautifully and had some high impact stuff. And he was a game winner when you played him on 2, and that's why he was a big part of the meta. Surprised a lot of people. We all thought this condition would be too big of a price to pay for the effect, but it turns out, he's just so good when he gets played on 2. He runs away with games. It's really hard to lose when Keleseth played on 2 back in that era. So yeah, of course I gotta recognize Keleseth. He is the 2-drop in a lot of ways. And then let's take a look at Wild Growth. Man, this one was such a ramp engine for Druid for so very long. A variety of Druid decks, of course, could use Wild Growth. That ranges all the way back to like Force Roar Druids way back in the day. And then, of course, a bunch of varieties of ramp Druid, because it turns out getting Wild Growth on 2 and getting a lot of mana early in the game is, again, very powerful if you hit this on curve, but still some utility late in the game too, getting some card draw if you need to once you've capped out on mana. That kind of backup plan for Wild Growth, I think, always made the card really good. So as it was such a staple for Druid and there were so many different Druid decks that use this one to great success, Wild Growth had to be included, I think. All right, so next up is Libram of Wisdom, and I've talked this card up a couple times in recent videos and always get a little bit of pushback. I guess some people aren't quite as excited by Libram of Wisdom as I am, but here's my pitch for Libram of Wisdom and why I think it belongs in this video. Libram Paladin has been really good, like at the top of the meta, a variety of metas across multiple expansion releases for basically the last 2 years. Not right away when it got released, it took some buffs to other cards, but ever since then, Libram of Wisdom has been the fuel for high tier, often tier 1, sometimes the best deck in the game level Libram decks. And, you could argue there are other parts of the Libram package that deserve the spot, but this is the 2-mana spot. And I think really comes down to this card very often. Those late game scenarios where you play a Liadrin and you get like 8 of these in hand, and that's your win condition, just overwhelming people with the value of Libram of Wisdom, not to mention the kind of incremental tempo advantages it often offers throughout the early to mid game. So for me, this is really the centerpiece in a lot of ways of Libram Paladin, and because that has been such a prominent deck archetype for multiple years, we've rarely seen a deck that can survive across so many different metas. I had to give Libram of Wisdom a spot, perhaps a little recency bias, but not really, just because it's been a full-on like 2-year game plan all centered around Librams. And then moving on over here to Blood Mage Thalnos. There was an era where I think Thalnos was a really obvious choice for this list, because back in the day in early Hearthstone, you could put Thalnos in pretty much any deck, and many decks did, because he was, just kind of a do-everything sort of card. You got the spell damage upside, which could be pretty relevant sometimes. You got some card draw bundled in there, little body as well. So a variety of different synergies and ways this card could do cool things for you. So we saw him popping up in Druid and Mage, I think in particular. Rogue would often use this card as well. And for the first few years of Hearthstone, this was like one of the best legendaries you could craft, because you knew you were going to get a lot of utility and return on your investment, because so many decks would play Thalnos. And he still pops up in decks recently. Like in the last couple of years, there are still sometimes Thalnos has made sense. Not nearly as often, not as reliably, but, still does a lot for a classic card that's been around forever that, has somehow kept up almost with the power creep of Hearthstone. So all in all, this used to would have been like the number 1 or 2 card. This is a video with no particular order. But for me, Thalnos kind of barely made the cut this time. We're starting to forget the relevance of Thalnos over time to some extent, but I think has still done enough to earn this spot. And then we have Incanter's Flow, which, in case you forgot, was a 2-mana card. Incanter's on 2 again. If you hit these like really powerful cards, the Keleseths, the Flows, even the Wild Growths on 2, Fire War Axe off that, it felt like you're just going to win a game. I think Incanter's Flow might actually be the strongest of those effects, perhaps even stronger than Prince Keleseth in his era. Because Incanter's Flow at 3 mana is still causing problems in Mozaki Mage. It's still a totally insane card, because it's just so much cost reduction over the course of the game. And of course, Mage is built really well to exploit those sorts of advantages. So of course, I had to include Flow. It's had a peak that is higher than almost any 2-drop ever, maybe ever. It's just so darn powerful for 2 mana. And you gotta put cards like that on this list. And then we have Incanter's Flow's cousin here with Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I'll be honest, this one barely made it into the video for me, because I think a Sorcerer's Apprentice has really been more problematic in wild format, especially recently with Flamewaker stuff and Ignite stuff. In standard format, Sorcerer's Apprentice history hasn't been quite as dominant or like top of the meta, but it has still shown up time and time again, because of course cost reductions can be broken. And we had Flamewaker stuff in that era of standard. We had crazy OTK Exodia Antonitis stuff, which wasn't always the best deck, but was often a very popular and very commonly seen deck. So I think Apprentice has just had a lot of resiliency where she's made sense in a handful of different kind of crazy mage decks and often feels broken when she gets played. So I still wanted to recognize that. I don't think this card is safe. I think this one actually feels more broken than it probably was in practice. I think you could easily swap this out for a lot of other options, including maybe a handful from that old video 6 years ago. But for me, Apprentice was still noteworthy enough to earn this list spot. And the next up is Eviscerate, another classic card that has shown up through so many different iterations of Rogue. And of course, there's been a lot of good Rogue decks throughout the year that utilize Eviscerate as a key part or complementary part of its finishing damage package. Because for the longest time there, 2 mana for 4 damage was crazy. Now, I mean, there's an argument to be made that cards like Wicked Stab or even Garrote now are both kind of better versions of Eviscerate. And you might say, well, hey, those are higher power level cards. Why don't you include those on the list? And frankly, they're both really good, and I think could be argued for top 10, top 20 spots very easily. But, you know, part of this is recognizing sort of long-term consistency. And because Eviscerate was good forever and was basically good right until it rotated out of standard format, I wanted to give the nod here to Eviscerate. Basically, all 3 of those kind of 2 damage burst cards are big important things in Rogue, and we're seeing kind of the new versions of Eviscerate in those other cards, essentially. But this is the granddaddy of them all, and I can't imagine how many games have been lost to an Eviscerate face, perhaps as many as any other card in Hearthstone. Perhaps Leroy's #1. This might be #2. And then finally, if I had a #1 spot, although this video is in no particular order, I think the #1 spot would go to Zephrys the Great. And man, we're not too far away from Zephrys in standard format, but this guy was perfect. And yeah, occasionally he whiffed and did some weird stuff, but 98% of the time, Zephrys really did give you the perfect card, very often securing you some kind of weird lethal through a Bloodlust or a Fireball over the top, or sometimes like the perfect Hex to answer your opponent's big threat. And that's why for a couple years during his era in Standard, Highlander decks were very good and very prominent because Zephrys and whatever other class version from Uldum powered a bunch of different decks really well. And we saw people like building decks that didn't really have any other reason to be Highlander decks just because Zephrys was so good. We even saw people putting Zephrys into duplicate decks just so they'd have him at like the end of the game once they drew enough cards because he'd give you some kind of perfect tool. So, you know, when a card is working in decks where he's not even supposed to really work, that's a really good sign for his strength. He was so powerful. He just looked for excuses to have that Zephrys play. And of course, that made him one of the most popular cards in Hearthstone for years, year and a half, whatever he was in standard format. And I kind of miss Highlander decks, actually. I wouldn't mind some more Zephrys action in my life. I think it'd be kind of cool if he came back in the core set and we got another year of Highlander shenanigans on the back of this guy, because he's just such a cool design, and the mechanic and the functionality was probably so much work. It's kind of a shame we've forgotten about him in Standard for now. And yeah, there you go. That's the list. Those are my 10 best 2-mana cards in the history of Hearthstone. Again, there were so many choices for this video. Like I had to cut so many good cards, and you know, I tried to show some deference to older cards, in particular classic cards that were good for 3 or 4 years early in Hearthstone were prioritized for me. But if you have a different approach, if you care more about like peak power levels or power spikiness in a given meta, you'll probably have some different choices than I will. But I tried not to lean too much into recency bias and recognize, you know, a good long history of Hearthstone and relevance throughout the years. So that said, of course, please share your thoughts in the comments below for cards you would have cut from the list, cards you would have added in. Oh, and also feel free to share your 3-mana predictions. What cards do you think are going to show up in the 3-mana version of this video sometime in the next week or so? Stay tuned for that. So that said, thanks so much as always for watching. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. And until next time, game on.